The power went out at 214 Cedar Hollow Court at 6:47 in the morning, and Walter Briggs knew before he even reached the breaker panel that this wasn't a blown transformer or a downed line. He knew because 3 weeks earlier, a letter had arrived on Cedar Hollow Estate's HOA letterhead, informing him that his amateur radio antenna constituted a flagrant interference with the community smart grid mesh network under Section 7.4.2 of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, and that continued noncompliance would result in remedial action, up to and including suspension of grid access. He'd read that line 4 times and told his wife it was an empty threat, the kind of thing boards printed to sound important. He was wrong. Eleanor's oxygen concentrator ran on battery backup for exactly 4 hours before it needed line power again, and Walter stood in his kitchen at 6:51 that morning, doing the math he'd spent 34 years doing professionally. Load calculations, backup capacity, failure windows. Except this time, the variable he couldn't solve for was a 61-year-old board president named Gary Halloran, who had just used a system Walter warned him not to build, to do exactly the thing Walter had warned him it would one day be used for. By 7:15, Walter had his neighbor's generator running an extension cord through the side window. By 8:40, the Larkspur Volunteer Fire Department was in his driveway, because a home health line had flagged Eleanor's concentrator as offline and dispatch treated it as a welfare emergency. By that evening, a reporter from the Larkspur Ledger was standing on his porch asking if it was true that a homeowners association had disconnected a disabled woman's medical equipment over a ham radio antenna. Walter told her it was true. He also told her it wasn't the first time Gary Halloran had invented a rule to get what he wanted. It was just the first time it had almost killed someone to do it. Drop your city. And tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many are watching from behind enemy lines right now. Cedar Hollow Estates sits on 400 acres outside Larkspur, Texas, a town of 11,000 people 40 minutes north of Austin that spent the 2010s absorbing exactly the kind of master-planned subdivision that Cedar Hollow represents. Curved streets with names like Hollow Bend and Whisper Creek, a community pool shaped like a kidney bean, and CC&Rs running to 61 pages of what residents could plant, paint, park, and, as it would turn out, power. Walter and Eleanor Briggs bought the house at 214 Cedar Hollow Court in the spring of 2013, back when the development was still half-built and the HOA dues were $40 a month, and nobody had yet discovered how much fun it was to fine each other. Walter was 55 then, 29 years into a career as a distribution engineer for Texas Gulf Power, the kind of job where you learn, in granular and occasionally terrifying detail, exactly how much can go wrong when the people controlling electrical infrastructure don't understand electrical infrastructure. Eleanor taught middle school choir for 31 years before her lungs started failing her. Pulmonary fibrosis, diagnosed in 2018, the kind of disease that turns the power went out from an inconvenience into a countdown. Cedar Hollow's transformation from ordinary suburb into a case study happened in 2019, when the developer, on its way out the door, sold the HOA on something unusual, a community-owned solar and battery microgrid, marketed as a green amenity that would cut every homeowner's electric bill and insulate the neighborhood from grid outages during the increasingly vicious Texas summers. The board at the time, not Gary's board, the one before it, approved a $2.3 million special assessment to build it. Walter, newly retired and the only person in the subdivision who'd spent 3 decades designing exactly this kind of system professionally, showed up to the town hall meeting and told them, politely, that it was a bad idea to centralize control of every home's power connection under a 5-person volunteer board with no engineering background and no legal obligation to use that control responsibly. You're building a system, he told them, that lets whoever's sitting in that president's chair decide who gets electricity. That's not a green amenity. That's a weapon, and eventually, somebody's going to pick it up. They built it anyway. Section 7.4 of the amended CC&Rs, ratified by a mail-in ballot that 31% of the community actually returned, gave the board authority to suspend or restrict smart grid access for cause, including, but not limited to, unpaid assessments, safety hazards, or interference with network operations. Walter's objection was recorded in the minutes and then, like most objections recorded in HOA minutes, never looked at again. For 6 years, nothing happened. The system worked the way infrastructure is supposed to work, invisibly. Homes got slightly cheaper power. The board occasionally shut off a delinquent account, always after months of unpaid dues, always with paper notice, always for people who genuinely owed money. It was, by HOA standards, almost boring. Then, in November of 2021, Gary Halloran won the board presidency by 19 votes, and boring stopped being the operating condition at Cedar Hollow Estates. Gary owned Halloran Landscaping Group, a company that had, in the 2 years since his election, become the HOA's exclusive vendor for lawn maintenance, tree trimming, and, this detail would matter enormously later, routine inspection and servicing of the smart grid substation equipment, a contract Gary's own company had no particular qualification to perform, beyond the fact that Gary controlled the vote that awarded it. Residents grumbled. Nobody organized. That's usually how it goes, right up until it isn't. Walter's trouble with Gary started small, the way it almost always does. In January of 2026, Walter noticed the landscaping invoices posted in the HOA's quarterly newsletter had jumped nearly 40% from the prior year, with no corresponding increase in services rendered. Same crew, same schedule, same equipment, 38% more money. Being an engineer, Walter did what engineers do. He asked for the underlying data. On March 3rd, he submitted a formal written request under Texas Property Code Section 209.005, demanding the association's financial records, vendor contracts, and board meeting minutes going back 3 years. Under Texas law, the association had 10 business days to produce the records or provide a written explanation for delay. Gary Halloran did neither. What he did instead, 15 days later, was mail Walter a violation notice. Now that you know Walter Briggs, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has done. The notice, dated March 18th, cited CC&R Section 7.4.2, network interference and unauthorized equipment, and alleged that the amateur radio antenna Walter had operated legally, with an active FCC license, from a 32-foot mast in his backyard since 2015, 11 years, without a single prior complaint, was now generating electromagnetic interference incompatible with smart grid mesh communications, and that Walter had 14 days to remove it or face a daily fine of $75, escalating to grid suspension if unresolved. There was no engineering report attached. There was no interference log, no frequency analysis, no complaint from the utility contractor who actually monitored the mesh network. There was, Walter would later confirm through his own testing equipment, the same spectrum analyzer he'd used professionally for 3 decades. No interference at all. His antenna operated on amateur bands nowhere near the 900 MHz range the smart grid mesh used for its device communication. It was, in the driest possible technical sense, an invented violation, built out of nothing, timed to arrive 15 days after Walter asked to see the books. He wrote back, politely at first, a 2-page letter explaining the frequency separation, offering to have an independent RF engineer confirm it, and reminding the board that his Section 209.005 request remained unanswered. Gary's board did not respond to the technical argument. It responded on April 1st, with a second letter stating that the hearing requested, Walter hadn't requested one, but the letter said he had, was scheduled and conducted on March 28th, a date on which Walter had not been notified of any meeting, had not attended any meeting, and had, according to his calendar, been at a cardiology appointment with Eleanor, 40 minutes away in Round Rock. The letter informed him the violation had been upheld, and fines were now accruing retroactive to March 25th. By April 20th, the fine total sat at $1,950. Walter kept every letter in a manila folder that would, within 2 months, become considerably thicker. He also kept doing the one thing Gary Halloran seemed not to have counted on. He kept asking for the financial records, now citing the board's failure to comply within the statutory window as a separate violation of state law, this one committed by the association rather than against it. On April 21st, Walter attended the regular monthly board meeting, a real one this time, with an actual agenda posted 72 hours in advance, as Texas law requires, and asked, on the record, why his $209,005 request from 6 weeks earlier remained unanswered, and why a hearing had been recorded for a meeting he was never told about. Gary Halloran, according to 3 residents who were present, told Walter that the board's decisions aren't up for cross-examination, and gaveled the discussion closed. Walter sat back down. He did not raise his voice. He also did not stop asking. 24 hours later, his power went out. The morning of April 22nd unfolded the way emergencies do, too fast to process and too slow to survive, both at once. Eleanor's concentrator alarm chirped at 6:49, 2 minutes after the outage, its battery indicator already counting down from 4 hours. Walter, who had spent his career designing systems with redundancy precisely so that a single point of failure couldn't turn into a medical crisis, discovered in real time what it feels like to be on the wrong end of a system with exactly 1 point of failure and a board president who controlled it. He called his neighbor, Ruth Delgado, 3 doors down, who had a portable generator from hurricane season 2 years back that had never once been used. Ruth's husband, Marcus, had it running in Walter's driveway in 11 minutes, snaking a heavy-gauge extension cord through the kitchen window to keep the concentrator alive, while Walter called the HOA's after-hours line. The property management company, Lone Star Community Management, which handled Cedar Hollow's day-to-day operations under contract to the board, and, when neither answered inside 20 minutes, the fire department's non-emergency line, because Eleanor's home health monitoring service had already flagged the outage and a truck was already en route. The Larkspur Volunteer Fire Department doesn't typically respond to power outages. It responded to this one because Eleanor's monitoring service treated an offline medical device as a welfare check, and because the address on file noted a home oxygen dependency. 2 firefighters arrived at 8:40, found Eleanor stable, thanks to Ruth and Marcus's generator, and filed an incident report that would, 3 weeks later, become Exhibit A in a story neither Walter nor Gary Halloran could have predicted the size of. Lone Star's regional manager, a harried woman named Priya Anand, who clearly had not been read in on whatever Gary had decided to do, called Walter back at 11 a.m., confirmed the smart grid relay for 214 Cedar Hollow Court had indeed been remotely deactivated at 6:47 that morning, and confirmed the deactivation had been authorized by Board President Gary Halloran personally, outside of any board vote, citing unresolved Section 7.4 violation. Power was restored by 1:15 p.m., after Priya, to her credit, overrode the relay herself and told Walter, off the record, that she'd flagged the incident to Lone Star's legal department because this isn't how we're supposed to use that system, and I don't think it's how the board's supposed to use it either. The Larkspur Ledger ran the story 2 days later, on April 24th, under the headline, HOA Cuts Power Over Radio Antenna, Nearly Endangers Oxygen-Dependent Resident. The reporter, a persistent 26-year-old named Priya, no relation, a different Priya, Priya Osei, had pulled the fire department incident report through a public records request of her own, and gotten Gary Halloran on the phone for exactly 40 seconds before he hung up on her. Local news station KZAM Channel 9 picked it up the following week, running Eleanor's photo next to her concentrator, and the story that Gary Halloran had probably imagined staying contained inside a 61-page CC&R document instead ended up on television. $1,950 in fines over a radio antenna that never interfered with anything. Power cut off from a woman on oxygen. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done? Gary Halloran, whatever else could be said about him, did not respond to public scrutiny by backing down. He responded by escalating, which is the single most reliable thing a power-tripping board president will do when cornered, and which is why the next 6 weeks of Walter and Eleanor Briggs's life turned into a slow-motion demonstration of exactly how much damage a 5-person volunteer board can do to 2 people who did nothing wrong. On April 29th, a week after the outage made the news, the association's attorney, a Round Rock firm called Petrosky and Vance that represented roughly a third of the HOAs in the greater Austin metro and billed Cedar Hollow $340 an hour to do it, filed a notice of assessment lien against 214 Cedar Hollow Court. The lien totaled $4,750. The accumulated antenna fines, now at $2,700, after continued daily accrual, the board refused to pause, even after the news coverage. A $1,200 administrative processing fee, invented, as far as Walter could tell, on the spot, and $850 in attorney's fees for filing the lien itself. Under Texas Property Code, Chapter 209, an HOA generally cannot foreclose over fines alone, only over unpaid regular or special assessments. But Petrosky and Vance had structured the lien carefully enough, folding fines into assessments, that it would take a lawyer of Walter's own to untangle whether it was enforceable at all. The letter accompanying the lien reminded Walter that failure to satisfy it within 30 days could result in further collection action, including foreclosure proceedings. 3 days after that, on May 2nd, Gary filed a complaint with the Federal Communications Commission, alleging Walter operated his amateur station in violation of FCC Part 97 rules, specifically claiming unauthorized power output and interference with licensed commercial services. It was, like the original CC&R violation, built from nothing. Walter's station was registered, his output was well within his license class, and the FCC's Regional Enforcement Office, after a cursory review, dismissed the complaint within 11 days for lack of any supporting evidence. But for those 11 days, Walter didn't know that yet, and the letter informing him a federal complaint had been opened against him arrived the same week as a lien on his house, which is precisely the kind of pressure that's designed to make an ordinary 68-year-old man simply give up. Then came the email. On May 6th, Gary Halloran sent a mass email to all 211 households in Cedar Hollow Estates, using the HOA's official community distribution list, a use of association resources that would itself later become a point of contention, describing Walter's antenna as a documented safety hazard that has already caused one medical emergency in our community, and urging residents to support the board's efforts to protect the integrity of shared systems from individual homeowners who believe the rules don't apply to them. It never mentioned that the medical emergency was Eleanor's oxygen concentrator, cut off by Gary's own board. It didn't need to. Enough neighbors read between the lines, or didn't bother to, and for about 2 weeks, Walter and Eleanor experienced something the manila folder of violation letters couldn't fully prepare them for. A handful of neighbors crossing the street to avoid conversation. One particularly enthusiastic Halloran ally posting in the community Facebook group that Walter was the reason we can't have nice things, and a silence from people who'd been friendly for over a decade, unsure which side of an HOA fight was safe to stand on. Eleanor, who had spent 31 years managing a middle school choir room and had a fairly refined instinct for which conflicts were worth having, told Walter one night in May that she was tired, not of Gary particularly, but of watching her husband spend his retirement fighting a man whose entire authority rested on a document nobody had read closely enough to notice was being abused. "You built systems for a living," she told him. "Maybe it's time you built one that doesn't let this happen to the next family." Walter took that more literally than she probably intended. What Gary Halloran did not know, what a certain kind of small-scale tyrant never seems to account for, was that Walter Briggs had spent 3 decades reading exactly the kind of documents Gary was hiding behind, and that 34 years of designing distribution systems for a public utility had left Walter with an instinct for finding the load-bearing wall in any structure, whether it was made of copper wire or legal boilerplate. The engine of Walter's fight back started, unglamorously, with a spreadsheet. He'd already been chasing the Section 209.005 records request since March. By mid-May, with a lien on his house and a dismissed federal complaint in his file, he escalated it into a formal complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission, which oversees certain HOA management company conduct, and, this was the move that mattered most, a records demand aimed specifically at every Halloran Landscaping Group invoice paid by the association since Gary's election in 2021, cross-referenced against the substation servicing contract nobody on the board seemed able to explain the bidding process for. Priya Anand at Lone Star, still uneasy about what she'd seen on April 22nd, quietly produced the records this time, not because Walter's second request was legally stronger than his first, but because a fire department incident report and a local news segment have a way of concentrating a property management company's compliance instincts. What the invoices showed, once Walter laid them out chronologically in a spreadsheet that would have made his old engineering supervisors proud, was a pattern that had nothing to do with landscaping and everything to do with money. Halloran Landscaping Group's contract value had risen from $94,000 a year in 2021 to $280,000 a year by 2025, a nearly 200% increase against a roughly flat scope of work. And buried inside that contract, since 2023, was a line item for smart grid substation maintenance and inspection, $46,000 a year, paid to a lawn care company with no electrical licensing on file with the state, subcontracted, invoice by invoice, to a vendor called Ridgeline Turf Solutions, which Walter discovered through a Texas Secretary of State business filing search that took him about 10 minutes, was owned by Gary Halloran's brother-in-law, Curtis Boyle. Walter just made a critical move, pulling 3 years of vendor invoices and cross-referencing them against a company owned by the board president's brother-in-law. Right call? What's your strategy? Walter didn't stop at the spreadsheet. He filed the records and his analysis on May 19th with the Texas Real Estate Commission and, separately, forwarded a summary to the Comal County District Attorney's Office. Cedar Hollow Estates sat just across the county line from Larkspur proper, flagging what looked, on paper, like a straightforward misapplication of association funds under the Texas Penal Code's provisions on theft by a fiduciary. He didn't have a law degree, and he was careful, in every letter, to say so. He wasn't accusing anyone of a crime, he wrote. He was asking someone with subpoena power to look at numbers that didn't add up. At the same time, Walter started doing something that mattered just as much as the paperwork. He talked to people. Ruth and Marcus Delgado, whose generator had kept Eleanor breathing, became the first 2 signatures on what would become a recall petition. Walter reached out to a retired attorney 2 streets over, a woman named Denise Whitfield who'd spent 20 years in municipal law before retiring to Cedar Hollow, and who agreed, after hearing the whole story over coffee, to review the lien filing pro bono, and confirmed what Walter suspected, that folding fines and an invented processing fee into an assessment lien to make it foreclosure eligible was, at minimum, an aggressive misreading of Chapter 209, and quite possibly unenforceable outright. Denise sent Petrosky and Vance a letter to that effect on May 22nd. The firm did not respond for 3 weeks, which told Walter everything he needed to know about how confident they actually were in the lien's validity. By early June, the coalition had a name: Cedar Hollow Homeowners for Accountability, a title Walter privately found a little grandiose, but Eleanor insisted made it sound serious enough that people would sign, and 41 signatures on a petition demanding a special meeting to consider recalling Gary Halloran and 2 board members who'd rubber-stamped the antenna violation, the lien, and the mass email, all under CC&R provisions that, buried in Article 11, actually made a recall vote fairly easy to trigger once you had the required percentage of homeowners on record. Priya Osei at the Larkspur Ledger ran a second story on June 8th. This one built entirely off the invoice records and the Ridgeline Turf Solutions filing, headlined, HOA President's Family Business, Quietly Build Community, $186,000 above market rate. KSAM Channel 9 sent a camera crew to Cedar Hollow's front gate. Gary Halloran reached for comment, told the reporter the invoices were fully approved by the board, and that Walter Briggs was waging a personal vendetta because of a legitimate rules violation. He did not explain the substation contract. He did not explain Curtis Boyle. He did explain, unintentionally, exactly why the recall petition kept gathering signatures all through the second half of June, because every time Gary opened his mouth in his own defense, he confirmed there wasn't one. The Comal County District Attorney's Office opened a formal inquiry on June 25th, after a financial crimes investigator reviewed Walter's referral alongside the invoices Priya Anand had produced, and found enough irregularity to justify a subpoena of Halloran Landscaping Group's and Ridgeline Turf Solutions' bank records. What that subpoena eventually turned up over the following month was not subtle. A pattern of invoices submitted by Ridgeline for substation work that, according to the equipment vendor's own maintenance logs, had never actually been performed. At least 4 inspections, billed and paid for on dates, when the maintenance company's remote monitoring system showed no technician credentials, had ever accessed the substation at all. Between 2023 and 2026, the association had paid out $186,400 for services that existed only on paper, funneled through Gary's brother-in-law's company, and, investigators would later allege, kicked back to Gary in cash and in the form of below-market lawn equipment purchases for Gary's own company. The emergency board meeting that Cedar Hollow Homeowners for Accountability had petitioned for was scheduled for July 14th, a date that would end up meaning considerably more than anyone expected when the petition was first circulated, because the DA's office moved faster than the recall clock did. On the morning of July 9th, 5 days before the community meeting, Gary Halloran was arrested at his home on Whisper Creek Lane and charged with theft by a fiduciary in excess of $150,000, a first-degree felony under Texas law, along with a separate misdemeanor charge related to the smart grid shutoff itself, unlawful denial of essential utility service, a charge the DA's office structured specifically around the April 22nd incident and Eleanor's medical dependency, after the fire department's incident report and Lone Star's internal records confirmed. Gary had ordered the relay deactivation personally, outside any board authorization, in direct response to Walter's records request, rather than any genuine safety concern. The July 14th meeting happened anyway, because a recall vote doesn't need the accused to be present, and because 200 residents showed up to a community clubhouse built for 90, spilling out into the parking lot with folding chairs and, in a few cases, their own portable generators sitting pointedly in truck beds, a detail the Ledger's photographer made sure to capture. Denise Whitfield chaired the meeting in her capacity as the coalition's designated parliamentarian, walked the room through the recall provisions in Article 11, and the vote, 188 in favor, 6 opposed, out of 211 eligible households, removed Gary Halloran and the 2 board members who'd approved the antenna fine and the lien from their positions that same night. After everything Walter and Eleanor went through, was it worth it? Have you fought your HOA? Tell me your story. Gary Halloran's criminal case moved through the Comal County court system over the following 5 months. He pled no contest in December to the felony theft charge and to the utility denial misdemeanor, in a plea agreement that included restitution of $186,400 to the association, a 5-year deferred adjudication on the felony count, and, at the DA's insistence, after Walter's attorney submitted a victim impact statement describing the April morning in granular engineering precise detail, a permanent injunction barring Gary from serving on any homeowners association board in the state of Texas. The new board, seated within a month of the recall and led by a genuinely reluctant Ruth Delgado, who agreed to serve as interim president mostly because nobody else would take the job, spent its first several meetings doing the unglamorous work of undoing what 6 years of accumulated authority had made possible. Section 7.4 was rewritten entirely by October, stripped of the language that had let one person authorize a shutoff unilaterally. The new version required a documented safety inspection by a licensed electrician, a unanimous board vote, and a minimum 72-hour written notice before any home's grid access could be suspended for anything other than genuinely unpaid assessments, verified through the association's independent accountant. The substation maintenance contract went out to competitive, licensed bid for the first time in 3 years and came back 40% cheaper than what Ridgeline Turf Solutions had been invoicing for work that was never done. Walter's antenna is still on its 32-foot mast in the backyard. Nobody has filed a complaint about it since, which is either evidence that it was never actually a problem or evidence that people finally checked the frequency chart. And either way, Walter counts it as a win. The lien against 214 Cedar Hollow Court was released in September, formally and in writing, with Petrosky and Vance's letter conspicuously omitting any admission that it had been improperly filed in the first place. Lawyers, Walter noted dryly, are consistent if nothing else. Eleanor's home health service now keeps a secondary battery backup on file at the house, not because anyone believes it will be needed again, but because Walter, an engineer to his core, no longer trusts a single point of failure to stay a single point of failure, community-owned microgrid or otherwise. He still keeps the manila folder. It's thicker now than it was in April, closer to an accordion file at this point, full of violation notices for a crime that never happened, a lien for money that was never owed, and a federal complaint the FCC dismissed in 11 days. He doesn't need any of it anymore. He keeps it the way some men keep a decommissioned tool, not because it's useful, but because it's proof of what it took to get here. If your HOA has ever tried to fine you for something that never happened, or made you feel like fighting back wasn't worth the cost, tell me below. This channel exists because your stories deserve to be told, even the ones your board hopes you'll forget. Subscribe, because there's always another one of these coming, and somewhere out there, another Walter Briggs is about to open a letter that starts with Notice of Violation.